Do you know why people weep loudly at a funeral for the elderly? According to the elders in the village, if there isn't heart-wrenching wailing at the funeral, it will be seen as a sign of ingratitude and disrespect from the descendants. And my mother was the professional mourner in the village. Unlike others, my mother only wept for ghosts, not for humans. In my entire life, I've only seen her cry twice. The first time was when she cried for my grandmother, who was suffering from cancer and somehow got better after that. The second time was the night of my father's wedding day, which was also the day she died. When others found him, he was blind, with blisters around his mouth, looking like he had eaten something extremely hot. There were many bite marks of varying depths on his arms, still bleeding, turning his originally white dress into a mix of deep and shallow red. What a curse! Why couldn't she die on any other day but my son's wedding day? My grandmother beat my mother's body, crying out loud, wishing she could come back to life and explain herself. I impatiently pushed her away, saying, "Enough. Respect the dead. And don't forget, it was me who saved your life." I spent hundreds of thousands on her treatment, both in hospitals and with traditional remedies. My grandmother still wouldn't accept it. Don't be so superstitious. This evil omen stuff is not that mysterious. Once, my grandmother held my mother's hand, crying and begging her to save her from death. My mother, who was kind-hearted, disregarding her 6-month pregnancy, locked herself in the room and said she would weep for a ghost, her own mother. At first, I didn't believe it, but 3 days later, my mother, looking haggard, opened the door and told me that my grandmother had recovered that day. However, due to the excessive mental exhaustion, my mother not only lost the baby but also damaged her own health. The baby she lost was the grandson my grandmother had always longed for. Because of this, my grandmother had a lot of grievances against my mother after she was discharged from the hospital. She cried, saying a simple sentence that instantly silenced the entire room. My grandmother's incessant chatter stopped, like a chicken being choked, her face turning pale and then green. Just then, a scream came from upstairs. Soon, my father ran down from upstairs in a panic, pulling my grandmother's sleeve and asking, "Mom, why is Yuzhuan upstairs?" Yuzhuan was my mother's real name. I had just finished bathing with Fang'er. When we opened the door, we saw him standing there, terrifying us to death. My father spoke hurriedly, but no one responded. We all stared at one place. My grandfather was a bit stunned by this scene. He rubbed his temples and looked at me, asking, "Did your mother really cry before she left?" I nodded. "Impossible," he said. "She's blind and mute. She can't cry." My father instinctively, but as soon as he finished speaking, he realized he had said the wrong thing. My grandmother told others that my mother was dying of an eye disease, but she never mentioned that my mother also had throat problems. By now, everyone knew that there was something wrong with my mother's death, but I couldn't care about that anymore. He walked over to my mother and looked at her for a moment. There was still some bloodstains on her face that hadn't been wiped off. He was somewhat knowledgeable, otherwise, he wouldn't have insisted on my father marrying my mother under pressure. The spirit of the dead is angry, and the mother ghost is furious. The child ghost died tragically, and the mother ghost will seek revenge. What should we do? Fang'er is still upstairs. She's carrying our Qin family's grandson, he said. I could clearly see the veins bulging on his temple. Obviously, he was also speechless at this moment because of my father, but there was nothing he could do. My father was his only son. He couldn't really beat or scold him. His gaze shifted from my father to me, and finally, he grabbed me and said, "Come with me upstairs." I was holding my mother's hand. When he pulled me, my mother's body swayed, and the blood that hadn't dried in her eye socket ran down her cheek, making it look like she was crying. My face darkened, and I instructed my grandmother to clean everything up before taking me upstairs. The second floor was very clean and quiet. The door to the new bedroom was ajar, and I could faintly see a red figure inside. "Go inside and bring your Aunt Fang down," he said, pushing me inside reluctantly. "Aunt Fang has your younger brother in her belly."